that good. We're all set.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Thank you again for inviting me, Southern Maryland Audubon, and thank you all of us for joining in tonight. I have a lot of information crammed in, and I've been giving a similar talk to this for many years and somehow seem to always learn something new from the people I'm talking with. So if you have questions or thoughts throughout, feel free to type those into the chat or save them for the end. I'm happy to stay on for a little Q&A. And yeah, I just wanted to kick us off tonight by saying happy fall, which is of course a joke because it is about 100 degrees here in Baltimore. I don't know about where you all are. Normally this time of year I'd be saying, yes, get out there with your new plants and start planting your trees. And of course we all know that fall is a fantastic time, not only for planting our gardens, but for starting to get some things in the ground. It's actually a fantastic time to take advantage of that dormancy over the winter and give plants kind of a head start in the spring, and they don't have to worry about that stressful summer period that plants in the spring have to deal with. So fall is an excellent time to be planting in our gardens, but we might need to hold off for a couple weeks before we get past this crazy weather here. So as a very quick introduction, I mean, that was a fabulous introduction that Molly gave me, but to reiterate a little bit, I am the Bird Friendly Communities Coordinator here in Baltimore, which is at Patterson Park Audubon Center. So we're part of Audubon Mid-Atlantic, part of National Audubon Society. I know all of the Audubons get a little bit confusing, so we can chat about that later if you'd like as well. I'm so excited that I'm helping you kick off your fall season because, you know, as I do these presentations in the spring and the fall, it gives me an opportunity to kind of think through them a bit, see if I want to make any tweaks. And I've actually been thinking ahead of this talk about the title of this presentation, Gardening for Birds. And I know a lot of us consider ourselves gardeners or even master gardeners, class of 2019 right here. I've been thinking about that word gardening and how, to me, it sort of implies this hobbyist, activity. So we're out putzing around in our gardens or, tinkering around in our gardens and planting this and doing that, when really what we're doing and the implications that it has for the other organisms that we share our world with are so much more important than that. So whatever the purpose is of whatever we're doing out there, whether out there looks something like this is actually Patterson Park in Southeast Baltimore City. Our office is right at the bottom here in this row house right on the corner. But I love this view of the city and the park because you can see all the way to downtown and you can see all the way to the inner harbor and how it stretches out to the Patapsco and the Chesapeake Bay. So maybe you're out there where you're tinkering around and your garden looks like this. Maybe it looks like this, or maybe it looks like somewhere else entirely. But whatever that purpose is, if we're out there tinkering by growing whole foods for ourselves and our families to eat, or we're out there putzing around and getting some fresh air, or maybe we just want our outdoor spaces to be beautiful and make us happy. Those are all fantastic reasons for gardening and doing that hobby that we love. But the choices that we make in that gardening or landscaping, if we want to be really legit about it, the plants that we choose and how we arrange them has hemispheric consequences. And that is because birds are hemispheric. So I like to start this story that you've trusted me to tell you by starting on a way zoomed out bird's eye view, this hemispheric view, and how Audubon's work is guided by the migratory nature of species. Not all of our bird species are migratory, but about 70% of our North American bird species are migratory. And so that means that Audubon has to work in collaboration with partners internationally across the Americas, As we zoom in, we see our state and our regional programs, as the case may be with Audubon Mid-Atlantic. We work in partnership with Audubon centers and chapters, of course. And then the most important are our community partnerships and all of the work that we each are doing individually in our own spaces, in our own communities, because that's inevitably where the birds are going to land. So as we zoom our story into focus, we're zooming into the Atlantic Flyway, best flyway of all the flyways, in my unbiased opinion. I hope that you agree with me, because the Atlantic Flyway is home to some of the world's most productive ecosystems. Just the Chesapeake Bay, if you think about it, and all of the amazing ecosystem services that we get just from that ecosystem. Largest estuary in the United States. So an amazing place for birds to be traveling along their migratory routes, but also home to 1/3 of the United States human population. So a lot of human density in our flyway. And that can be, of course, a challenge for our migratory birds as they're trying to find resting spots, places to stop and rest and refuel along these journeys. But we can also choose to see that human density and all of that human managed landscape as a real opportunity, because these are spaces that we have the power to control and to make those choices about what plants we plant and how to arrange them. So I just took a snapshot. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the website Birdcast. I just took this screen grab earlier today of how many birds are estimated to have flown over the state of Maryland last night. Almost 4 million birds. And that's not even the peak of migration. It's kind of tricky maybe to see, but this zigzaggy line shows us at night, there's this big peak of birds flying, and then this kind of gray line in the background shows that we're not even at the peak of migration. That'll happen in a couple of weeks and then extend through October. So millions and millions of birds are going to be migrating over the state of Maryland. And when they migrate over the state of Maryland or along the Atlantic Flyway, they're doing this at night for the most part, and this is what they look down and see. So now our story can kind of focus in on this single species. I love telling a story about this species. And since this is kind of a birding group, maybe I'll quiz you. Does anybody want to shout out the name of this species? Come off mute. I'll give you brownie points. I have a whole bunch of brownie points tucked away in my back pocket. No one knows this bird? This bird is called the wood thrush. It is maybe better identified by sound than by sight. It has one of the most beautiful songs, lives in the woodlands. And this wood thrush is a neotropical migratory bird species. It spends its winters in Central and South America. It is just as comfortable among the toucans and the howler monkeys in Costa Rica as it is here in Maryland. This bird is quite amazing because it weighs about the same as 15 pennies. I almost said 40 grams. So 40 grams, 15 pennies, if you can imagine holding 15 pennies in your hand. And yet this 40-gram, 15-penny of a bird will fly across the Gulf of Mexico in a single night. So it obviously has to have a lot of calories in order to do that. But along the way, if we're thinking about these migratory birds traveling at night and we're looking down at this scene that they see below them, we can see that there's also another issue. So, okay, you'll have to allow me a brief aside. I know that I'm supposed to be talking about gardening for birds, but as we are attracting birds to our gardens and inviting them there, we also need to make sure to not kill birds. So this is a brief aside, please allow me. As we're inviting birds to our gardens, please let's make sure, at least during migration, that we're thinking about our outdoor lighting and dimming that or turning it off entirely if it's not essential, trying to keep our indoor lighting inside during migration season by drawing our blinds, thinking about our outdoor lighting and whether it's on motion sensors or timers or down shaded so the light is going down to the ground and not up into the sky. And then as birds are waking up in the morning and they're trying to find food and protection, we don't want them to mistake the reflection of our landscape in our windows for an actual landscape where they can find food and shelter. And so addressing the reflectivity of our windows with some products such as these might be something to consider. So for an example, from left to right, this image on the left, at first I thought it was feather-friendly dots, but now that I look more closely, maybe it's not feather-friendly, but feather-friendly is a great product that I have on my windows. In the middle, those are bird savers. So they're actually these strings that are attached at the top and the bottoms of your windows. They're not stuck to the actual windows themselves. And then those bird silhouettes on the right actually come from a product called Kaleidoscape, which comes in a big sheet, but you can cut it into any shapes that you like. So that's my aside. I'm going to talk all about gardening for birds, but please think about our lighting and our glass in an effort to not kill birds. So back to our wood thrush. Hopefully our wood thrush, as it's making our way up the Atlantic Flyway or down as the case may be, and it's being lured towards our cities and towns by our lights, it's just inevitable. It's going to wind up in our cities and towns. It's going to wind up in our front yards or our patios or any of the spaces where it might end up. Hopefully it lands somewhere like this with some shelter, some plants where it can find all of its food groups. We're going to talk about that, and can find the things that it needs in order to continue along its migratory journey. For a lot of birds, unfortunately, this is where the story ends. And I don't like to dwell on this slide because it's not why we're here. We're here to take action and not think about the doom and gloom. But the case must be made that wood thrush populations, along with about 40% of all neotropical migratory songbird species, have been declining by about 2% each year and about half over the last 50 years. So we have roughly half as many wood thrushes today as we did 50 years ago. So birds are telling us that it is time to do something, and that is why we're all here. So individually, there's a lot that we can do. And then, of course, as we spread the word to our neighbors and our friends and our colleagues and anybody who will listen, we can make that collective and that synergistic impact as well. So we all learned probably in elementary school the elements of a habitat for every living thing. Everything needs food. We're going to talk a lot about the types of foods that birds need and how we can provide those outside of our bird feeders, because I know our bird feeders are so great, but it's just one of the many food groups that birds need. We also want to think about providing clean drinking water in our outdoor spaces. Birds use this in addition for bathing and cooling off and maintaining their feathers. I always get lots of questions about how to keep these things clean and healthy, and I can certainly answer those at the end so that we save more time now to get to the gardening stuff, which I know is why you're all here. When it comes to shelter, the density of our plantings is really what's going to provide birds with that shelter. So we're going to talk a lot about how to layer our plantings and make them really dense, just like nature plants plants. I've never walked into a meadow or a forest and seen plants separated by 18 inches of mulch. So that's not our goal either. And then lots of natural nesting sites so that birds that are residents and can mate up and have chicks in our region can find the resources that they need to do that. So getting into the bird food pyramid. When I was in school, I learned about the food pyramid. So we're doing the food pyramid because most birds actually eat a variety of foods throughout the year and throughout their life cycle. They might not just rely on one type of food. So I'm going to start with the top of the food pyramid, the sugar, right? All of that really good stuff that we love. Our nectar producing plants are really important in our landscape because of two main reasons. One, they are attracting lots of pollinators and providing that food resource for hummingbirds and insects and other animals to eat. But the other main reason that those nectar producing plants and flowering plants are so important in our gardens is because they're beautiful. And we want our gardens to be beautiful. And we want to make sure that we're thinking through the species in our gardens in a way that there is something blooming for the maximum amount of time throughout the year. And that's for both of those reasons. We want there to be nectar producing plants for our pollinators and our nectar eaters. And we also want there to be something beautiful in our gardens to make our gardens look purposeful, in addition to being a little bit wild. So choosing species that are blooming from spring through fall will accomplish that. Seeds are another really important food group for our birds because they are packed full of nutrients and minerals and healthy fats. So you may have heard that nuts are a superfood for humans, and that's because of those really healthy fats and those nutrients that are maintained for a long time in our bodies. So providing seeds in our landscape is, it's about choosing the right plants, but it's also a lot about maintaining in a bird-friendly way. So maybe not deadheading our flowers when they're done blooming, maybe leaving some of those seed-producing flowers throughout our landscape over the winter and into the spring. It's also a really good way to harbor overwintering insects that might be inside the dead stems of those plants. So lots of good reasons to keep those seed producing flowers up all winter long so that our resident bird species can use them and so that we are completing that insect life cycle in the spring. So it's fall. It's the best time to be thinking about our berry producing plants. Plants are not stupid, right? They can't move around and disperse and reproduce on their own. They rely on other animals to do that for them. And so they pack their seeds inside this fatty, sweet treat, and then they perfectly time the ripening of that treat to coincide with migration season when lots of birds are burning tons of calories. So birds are going to be making their way through our gardens. They're hopefully going to find lots of ripening berries on our berry producing shrubs. And all of that fat and sugar is going to help fuel their migration in the fall. So not all berries and berry producing plants are created equal. This might be a convenient selection of species, I will admit, from this study, but it's showing the average fat content in the berries of some non-native plant species, multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle, have less than 1% fat in their berries, compared to some native species, dogwoods and viburnums and spice bushes, which have almost 50% fat in their berries. So thinking about not only berry producing plants, but native plants and the caloric resources that they're going to provide to our fall migrating birds. So I've saved the best for last. 96% of terrestrial bird species eat insects. I know we've heard this by now. This is how our baby birds get protein. This is how they get all their carotenoids. Okay, if you were here for Ashley Kennedy's talk, Ashley and I went to University of Delaware together, and you can tell which one of us got the PhD because I was pronouncing carotenoids incorrectly until I heard her talk. So thank you, Ashley, for teaching me that. And if you haven't gone on to watch a recording of her talk, it is just fascinating, all of the work that she did to learn more about which kinds of invertebrates are being eaten by birds. But suffice to say, insects are a really important food group for birds. And to get insects and caterpillars in particular, we need native plants. Now, I know at this point in the game, and especially in the type of crowd who might come to an Audubon talk, You've probably heard all about why native plants are really important, but I'm going to tell you why anyway, because maybe you don't know, and that's okay. Or I also think that it's important to kind of hear this language and hear the explanation that we can then share with other people about why native plants in our landscapes are so important. Because, you know, in addition to being conservationists, right? We're not just tinkering around in our gardens. We are actual conservationists, hemispheric conservationists, right? Protecting these migratory species. So in addition to all of that, we're also all ambassadors. We have to relay this message to, again, anybody who will listen. And so I think it's important to kind of hear this explanation and be able to explain why native plants are so important. So we can share that non-native plants are not bad plants. It's not that non-native plants don't give us any ecological services. They still produce oxygen and clean our air and soak up water and filter the water and provide shade and all of those things. Maybe right plants in the wrong spot kind of deal. The really important thing that non-native plants do not provide is the ecological service of supporting the food chain. And that is because native plants are the link between the sun and the rest of our food chain. And most often, the rest of our food chain starts with an insect. This particular insect is one that a lot of folks are familiar with. So I'm going to offer up more brownie points if anybody wants to come off mute, or maybe share it in the chat. Would the chat feel more comfortable? Oh, I did put Julie. I didn't even see your answer in the chat. Julie gets the brownie points for identifying the wood thrush. Good job, Julie. Does anybody want to throw into the chat or come off mute and say what type of insect this is? Okay. Julie gets more brownie points for identifying that this is a monarch caterpillar. And does anybody know what type of plant monarch caterpillars eat? Ta-da! Milkweed. Okay. So monarchs, yes, excellent. All the brownie points. I'm just throwing out all the brownie points to everybody. Yes. Fantastic job, everybody. So this is a monarch butterfly caterpillar, and like monarch caterpillars, most insects, about 90% of herbivorous insects, can only eat one type of plant. So they're specialists. They can only eat the plants with which they co-evolved. And that is because, again, plants aren't dumb. They defend themselves with all of these nasty chemicals. They don't want their leaves to be eaten. And so it takes a really, really, really long time, like evolutionary time, for insects to develop the ability over many, many generations to digest those chemicals. And so as insects over many generations are developing oh my gosh, such a tongue twister, developing the ability to digest those chemicals, they're losing the ability to digest the chemicals in other types of plants, and hence specialization. So when we plant a milkweed or a meadow or a forest, we are in effect restoring this ancient food chain. When we plant Nandina, and I don't mean to throw shade on anybody who has planted Nandina, it's a very popular ornamental plant, makes these very beautiful berries. But unfortunately, Nandina supports exactly 0 species of caterpillars. I think the horticulture industry likes to call that pest-free. So pest-free, but also, you know, free of life and the dynamic food chain that is supported by vaccinium species, our blueberries and cranberries, which host almost 300 species of caterpillars. So we needn't worry about the insects chewing on our leaves, on our plants, because all of the natural enemies are going to be there to eat all of those insects. We do need to worry a little bit about our non-native species and their pest-freeness, and their ability to one day escape cultivation and become invasive, which is something that can take decades or even centuries. So lots and lots of benefits to planting native plants. I decided not to bore you with that long list in this presentation and instead get directly to how to actually do this. Now, the answer to that question is as varied as the number of people on this call, which is over 60, because each of us has a different, not even a yard. Maybe each of us has a different outdoor condition. There are all kinds of different questions that can come into play when deciding how exactly to do this type of landscaping, wildscaping, conservation landscaping, native scaping, whatever you want to call it. And so to start, I'm just going to start with these very broad, long-term goals and guidelines that can apply to all of us. And then my hope is that I will sort of take you through the process of asking yourself the right questions and point you to the right resources to know how to choose which species will work best in your scenario. So here are our long-term goals and guidelines. So number one, I want to encourage us over time to reduce the amount of lawn or paved surface you have by half. And we do that by, instead of thinking of where to put plants, we're going to think of where we want to do outdoor activities, where we want to walk. We're going to essentially create these outdoor rooms in our gardens, and put lawn there or patio there, and then plants everywhere else. So that's the goal. If you have a paved patio, the question, that process is exactly the same. And you can actually see this in these, I can even go back. You can see these outdoor rooms in both of these spaces. So there's an outdoor dining area. Perhaps you can see my cursor moving around. There's an outdoor dining area. There's a bird feeder station. And then there's kind of paths connecting these outdoor activity areas. The walls of these outdoor rooms are filled in by layers of plants. And same with a patio. An outdoor dining area. This couple, they live just north of Patterson Park. They love to dance on their patio, and they, know all of these different exotic dances. They're so fun. And then there are pathways to the alley into the back of their house, and everywhere else, all of the vertical space and horizontal space is taken up by plants. Our second goal and guideline is to plant densely in masses and in layers everywhere else outside of those activity areas or pathways or places that are difficult to mow. So I get the question a lot about where do I start? I don't know where to start. And we'll get to that a little bit, but almost always I'll say, is there a spot that's too wet or too steep to mow? Start there. So by layers, I mean that we are kind of creating the floor and the walls and the ceiling of our outdoor rooms. There's an ecological reason to do this. The number of layers of vegetation is actually the biggest contributor to animal biodiversity because each one of those layers provides more niches, more spaces for different species to occupy. So this is a really handy diagram of bird species that occupy each layer of vegetation, from our aerial predators and insectivores that are high up in the canopy surveying for their prey, all the way down to our thrushes and our sparrows that are foraging on the ground, scratching around in the leaf litter, and everything in between. So as many layers as you can incorporate into your garden, the better, because there are more niches and more spaces for more species to occupy. Even if you don't have a large outdoor space, these layers can be mimicked in container plantings. I am telling you that you can plant one milkweed plant and you will have a monarch find it and lay eggs on it. And I can tell you because that happened in my yard. So the layers in a container planting might look a little bit different. You might not have a canopy layer per se. Instead, we like to call these thrillers, fillers, and spillers. So you might have something that gives kind of like a pop or a pizzazz. It's eye-catching. There's a red twig dogwood in this container. That's our thriller. You might have something filling in. So there's some sensitive fern all tucked in here, and then maybe some spillers. So this is a heath aster that's spilling over the edge. So we're still kind of getting at those layers, but in obviously a much more compact scenario. And then my last long-term guideline is to avoid the plant zoo. So again, we're trying to plant like nature. Nature rarely plants specimens. Plants are more likely found in clusters, in masses, and this actually makes foraging a lot more efficient for our pollinators and our seed gatherers that are going from bloom to bloom and collecting their food. So essentially, we are designing a plant community. And I have 100% stolen that phrase from this book. If you haven't picked it up, you need to get it. Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rainer and Claudia West. So they call these the layers of a designed plant community, and we're going to go through each of these layers, and I'm going to go quickly. But really trying to get a community of plants through each of these layers, which have both an ecological function as well as a design function. We want our gardens to be beautiful, right? And so finding something that suits the conditions in our site and that fits each of those layers is going to be the best, provide the best resources for our birds and other wildlife, and also make our gardens look really full and healthy. I've also shown this book, The Living Landscape, Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy. You might know that Doug Tallamy and Rick Dark have several publications at this point, several books, all of which I would recommend. But this is a great, if you're like me and you're a visual learner, a great book full of photographs that really shows how these layers might look in different gardens. Just really beautiful photographs, and also a really helpful appendix that lists different native species and all of the different ecological and design functions that they provide. So I would recommend those. I'm going to start before we kind of dive into the layers by adding that you really should not need to amend your soil in order to do this kind of planting. You should try to plant for the soil that you have. And that might sound tricky if you have, soil that's full of clay and never drains and it's as hot as the sun. You might be thinking, well, I need to aerate or I need to amend my soil. But trust me that there are very few places on Earth where no plants can grow. And so finding those species is really the hard work of this process. 80% of the work that we're going to be doing in making our gardens more livable for wildlife is in researching the plant species. Once you know what to plant, it's just easy peasy, plop them in the ground and move them around. So I wanted to talk just briefly about the importance of this layering. Now, I know when I showed those layers of vegetation, we were talking about things like canopy and understory, but I really wanted to kind of get into these layers within the layers. This kind of planting is how we significantly improve the microclimate for the plants that we're planting in our gardens, and also provide that really important ground cover layer for ground foraging birds. So again, we're not separating plants by 18 inches of mulch. We're finding those plants that can fit within those taller species, and that allows more soil moisture to be held in the soil. It allows those surface temperatures of the soil to stay much, much cooler, and much happier plants. Also, if we leave spaces between our plantings, nature is going to fill those spaces. And we'll have more work to do in terms of, weeding and watering and things that we really don't want to do. One of the benefits of doing this kind of planting is just packing plants in as densely as possible so that we can avoid things like weeding and watering. So, quick look at how plants' roots look under the ground and what allows this type of planting to be really successful. So take a close look at this blazing star. When you buy liatris from the nursery, it's going to say to space these plants 12 to 15 inches apart. And that makes sense because if you look at how deep and how wide this plant's roots grow, of course, if you plant another plant of the same kind right next to it, they will be in competition with each other. They can't live right next to each other. But if you plant them 12 to 15 inches apart and nothing in between them, then you leave this empty space of soil that nature will fill with weeds, and the soil will be too hot and all of those things that I just described. So here is where we want to balance that planting with some shallow rooted ground covers. They're not competing for the same water and nutrients because their roots aren't occupying the same space of soil under the ground. So this is the type of kind of layers within layers that I'm talking about. Okay, so how do we know what to plant? Let's dive back into these layers. When it comes to designing your plant community, I would encourage you to start from the top down. After, of course, you become intimately acquainted with your soils, so you know what kind of soils your plants are going to be living in. So once you know what kind of soils you have and all the drainage and all of those things that you should ask yourself about how much sun they get, how much water is held in the soil, all of those important questions. Start with the top in your design because the plants that are closer to the ground are going to be shaded by, they're going to be impacted by the layers that are above them. So we call this the structural layer because we can think of it as sort of the studs of our walls of our outdoor rooms. So these are the species that are the tallest. Yes, things like our woody species, our shrubs and our flowering trees, things like hawthorn and serviceberry and dogwoods and viburnums. I'm just naming groups of plants that are really good for birds. But also some of our taller flowering species. So one of my faves, I believe, is what is depicted in this diagram, Joe Pyeweed. Also things like switchgrass. So these are our structural studs of our outdoor rooms species. This layer, this seasonal theme layer, are probably the native plants that most of us think about when we talk about planting native plants. So all of our seasonally blooming perennials, lots of choices here in terms of color and texture and form and fragrance. This layer can get a little bit overwhelming, and that's just because this is a much more diverse layer than the other layers. There are just more species of herbaceous plants than there are of woody plants. So if it helps to kind of get through that overwhelm, start thinking about sequence of bloom. So choose something that blooms in the spring, something that blooms in the summer, something that blooms in the fall. I will guide us to some resources that will help to narrow in our choices. So please don't be overwhelmed. But some quick examples, these are things like our goldenrods, our asters, our sunflowers, our coneflowers. I think I see some blazing star in this picture. And then the oft forgotten, but ever important ground cover layer. This layer is so important because it's really the workhorse of all the layers. This is the most functional layer. It's responsible for stormwater management. I mean, look at the density of roots in this layer. Stormwater management, erosion control, weed control. You can really think of the ground cover layer as green mulch. When I'm planting a new section of my garden, I'll, kill the turf grass or whatever is there by, smothering it with mulch. I don't add mulch again, ever. We're planting our plants really densely. We're planting with ground cover species so that we don't have to add mulch year after year. That's just kind of one of those weird human American things that is just kind of not really necessary, and we can get past it if we choose some clever ground cover species. So these species are often shade tolerant, although they might be planted in a sunny spot. And that's because these species will kind of emerge earlier in the spring when the soil is still cool and the days are shorter. And then by the time the soil warms up and the days are longer, they're getting shaded by the taller species that are surrounding them. So some examples include sedums, sedges, ferns. I'm pretty much like, if you're in a shady spot, look to the ferns. If you're in a sunny spot, look to the sedges. There are others, of course, but that's just kind of like where my mind goes. And then because nature refuses to be categorized, there is this one wackadoo weirdo layer, not really a layer, called the fillers. So these are just species that they don't want to fit into any layer. They're kind of opportunistic. They're important to incorporate if you can, because they can kind of fill in and plant themselves where there's an area of disturbance. Maybe you kind of overweeded or something died, and up will pop a columbine, or up will pop a coneflower, or blue mist flower. I have blue mist flower planted in my front yard, and it's looking very hot and dry. One popped up in a sidewalk crack and it looks beautiful. So those are our fillers. I'm going to kind of zoom through these because I'm looking at my time, but here's our canopy layer. Choose the most productive species, our oaks, our willows, our cherries. Working down from there, our understory and shrubs. Here's where we can really kind of start designing and choosing things that we think are beautiful and fit our aesthetic. I wanted to mention that this is doable at all different scales. It can feel kind of overwhelming if you have a large space. I'm going to show you how to kind of zoom in on one spot and be able to kind of tackle it one microclimate at a time. But even if you have a patio, this same kind of mindset is involved in this planting. So there's different layers here. There's no exposed soil or mulch here. Everything is packed in densely. And this person sees dozens of bird species in her little patio in Baltimore City. Okay. I'm going to zoom past this. We have 9 minutes. I wanted to mention cues to care. I get questions a lot of times about, how do I make sure that I'm staying within the regulations of my municipality? Won't I get a citation if I just have plants growing everywhere? Cues to care is a phrase that kind of teaches us how to frame our messy ecosystems with a couple, strategic tasks that, depending on where your garden is located, need to have, more or less attention paid to them. So these two images on the left are actually from the same yard. The image on the top is in the front yard. You can actually, if you look very closely, see the neighbor's house across the street. And so we have this nice edge with mulch, and it's mowed, and very purposeful cues to care framing that native planting. Same yard on the bottom left, but it's in the backyard. Doesn't get as many eyes on it. It's allowed to grow a little more wild. This image in the center top shows a cue to care that is kind of limbing up and pruning down our woody plants to allow a line of sight to our doors and windows. So that's another way to show that, yes, we are alive inside our houses. No need for concern. We are just growing some native plants at all different layers here and inviting lots of birds and other species, but no cause for alarm. Center bottom image has some structure to it. Any kind of structure like raised beds or fences, pots of plants, that's obviously going to tell people that this is a purposeful planting. It's a very literal framing of the garden in this case. And then these images on the right show an overlapping sequence of seasonal visual interests. So something visually appealing at all times of year, something blooming in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, maybe some overwintering berries or some interesting bark or plants with an interesting growth habit, but some kind of visual interest all season long. Otherwise, our gardens can just kind of look like a big, just mass of plants, which to the untrained eye maybe just looks kind of overgrown and under curated. Okay, I'm showing gardens in front yards, backyards. I really kind of despise the phrase backyard habitat because it implies that we must restrict our habitat plantings to the backyard when really they can be in our front yards, they can be in our side yards, they can be on our patios, they can be on our balconies, they can be spilling out into our alleys, they can be in our window boxes and our curb strips and our tree pits. And if you live on a boat, you can have bird-friendly habitat there too. Okay, in the last 6 minutes, I may have packed in too much, forgive me. Let's make a plan. So first thing we're going to do is map out our entire property. This might sound kind of like a tough assignment, but I promise that it will kind of make things easier to plan for in the future. You don't have to write down exactly which plant you're going to put where and not deviate from that. Definitely, I have not followed that advice in my own yard, but I think it's good to have a scale drawing because then you can start to add in your activity areas, your outdoor rooms. So maybe you have an outdoor dining area or an outdoor seating area, or a veggie garden, or a jungle gym for your kids. Put those things onto your map. And anything that's existing and not going anywhere, a shed, water source, a patio, a deck, all of those things. Map all of those out. And then once you have those outdoor rooms designated, then we can think about connecting them with walkways. And however you want to connect these activity areas is entirely up to you. There are people who will say, oh, it should be curved paths, and this allows you to walk more slowly, and it's more natural. And maybe you want to have like a super traditional English garden, or you want to have a super modern slate patio with right angles. The birds and the insects, I promise you, do not know the difference. So that is entirely up to you and your design aesthetic, how you choose to map out these walkways and how you want your garden to feel and how you want to move between these different activity areas. Once you have your walkways all mapped out, then you can think about how to work in from the edges with your plantings as opposed to making islands. So this will allow you kind of over time. Obviously, you're not going to be doing this planting all at once unless you have a very big budget, in which case I'm sure Southern Maryland Audubon would love to chat with you about a possible donation. But over time, you can kind of plant, a foot or two at a time. Maybe start with your canopy or your understory trees and then work in from the edges, work out from the edges with your perennials and your ground covers. So first thing we have to do is think about all of the site conditions that are going to help us determine what to plant. And like I said, don't be overwhelmed at the scale of this because more than likely your garden is a collection of microhabitats. So if you just zoom in on one area and ask yourself all of the questions you want to know as much as you can about that one spot so that you can choose a plant or a group of plants that are going to thrive in that one spot. So that might be determined by directionality, north, south, east, west, where's the sun going? Topography, is it north facing, is it south facing? What kinds of things already exist in that spot? Buildings, other plants. There's a long list of questions to ask yourself. I have a resource on our website that is kind of like a let's get started, questions to ask yourself and resources to seek out. I'll show you where it is on our website so that I can zoom past this and we don't have to go through all of these questions. So you're going to ask yourself all these questions. You're going to get intimately acquainted with this one spot in your garden where you're trying to find the perfect species that will thrive here. We're actually going to zoom in on this square, this 100 square foot space. So what's existing? We have this, probably an understory tree. If I'm imagining that this is 100 square feet, 10 by 10, then this isn't a very large tree at all, but we're going to act like that understory tree is already existing there. And then over here, we have mowed lawn, but we want to figure out what to plant in this space. So we're starting with the tallest layer that we can, the tallest layer that we have room for or want to plant. So we're going to choose our shrubs, our structural layer. They're going to form the studs of our walls of this outdoor room or this walkway or whatever is on the other side of this planting. Then we're going to think about our seasonal theme layer, the tallest of those species. Okay, so the different colors are representing different species that I'm planting here. A few different species because over here under these shrubs and trees, these plants might need to be a little more shade tolerant. This purple species in the back can be taller because it's in the middle or it's in the back of our planting. These species, the pink one in the front can be a little bit shorter. Maybe you want it to have something with fragrance since it's the one that you're walking past. You'll notice that if this is a 10 by 10 space, these plants maybe are too big to plant right next to each other, a foot off center from each other. And that's where we're going to fill in finally with our ground cover species. So you can kind of see how you might have these masses of flowering plants and they aren't going to fit right next to each other, but in between is where we're going to plant those ground cover species. So it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to point you towards some resources on our website. And then I apologize, we're going over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that we have. So patterson.audubon.org is our website. And under that conservation tab, you will find the Plants for Birds page. When you go to that page, you'll scroll to the bottom where you see this list of downloadable resources. And the first one that I want to point you towards, if you're like, I just don't even know where to start, just tell me which plants to plant. These top 10 lists are a really great way of narrowing down your options because it lists the top 10 trees, the top 10 shrubs, and the top 10 herbaceous plants. It's actually the most productive genera, so the groups of plants, so like goldenrods, oaks, and that'll really help you narrow it down. So you want to plant something in this type of soil and you want it to be the most beneficial for insects and birds, and you only have room for a perennial plant. You're going to be looking for something in the goldenrod group or the asters or the sunflowers. Those are the top 3. And then I would also point you to these seasonal maintenance guides, which tell you which things to do by season in your garden to make your gardens the most bird friendly by doing certain tasks at certain times. And then this is actually linked to National Audubon's native plant database. So you can type in your zip code and find which species are native to your specific area. So I just spit a lot of information at you. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I can also put my contact information in the chat. But Molly, you can let me know if we have any questions already or how you want people to be able to submit their questions.
Erin, thank you so much. This was great. This was just so much really helpful information, and you made it really accessible, I think, to both, gardeners who've been doing it for years and gardeners who are just getting started. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. And after we take these, anybody out there who has questions, feel free to ask. When you were talking about berries early on, someone asked, what about poke?
Oh, pokeweed. Okay. I'm assuming you're talking about pokeweed, which is a berry producing perennial, actually. It's not a It's not a woody plant. Pokeweed is probably not a plant you will find at a nursery. It's not really considered to be like a plant that people would cultivate, but it will find its way into your yard because birds love it. So birds will eat up all the berries and then they'll poop them throughout your yard. And so if you don't get rid of that one pokeweed, the next year you will have many pokeweeds. And if that is something that you are okay with, then by all means, it's great for the birds. My warning to you is that if you have small children, the berries are actually poisonous to people. And the berries are also very, if you touch them, they like stain your skin. So if you have little ones, maybe not the best choice. I tend to, if they're kind of growing like in the back of my plants, I'll let it go unless it starts growing into my neighbor's yard. I live in a row house. It's a very kind of compact situation, but my neighbors probably think I'm crazy because I'll go out and I'll pull up all of the porcelain berry and the oriental bittersweet, but I'll leave the pokeweed and I'll leave the Virginia creeper.
Great, thanks. And so we have another question when you were talking about the fat content. And someone asked, are the fat contents of cultivars of native species known? Things like low mound or winter red or viburnum, Christum?
That is an excellent question. I'm not sure if that research has been done. Gosh, the question about cultivars always comes up. And some research has been done. If you've heard a talk by Karen Berghart at the University of Maryland recently, also a Doug Tallamy lab graduate, she has done some interesting research on nativars, so how many insects are supported by native cultivars of natives versus non-natives. And her findings are that it's kind of somewhere in between. So maybe not as ecologically beneficial as straight species of natives, but better than non-natives. When it comes to fat content of the berries, I have no idea. I don't know if that research has been done yet. If somebody knows or finds that research, I would be very eager to read it if you would send it to me.
What was the name of the person you just mentioned who did the research on cultivars?
Oh, Karen Berghart. Let me put, is it Karen with an I? I think it is Berghart at UMD. I just put her name in the chat.
And Jan, did you have another question you wanted to ask about removing the flower stalks?
Why, yes, I did. So we have a total front yard full of Rudbeckia. It is not very diverse. It's like 80% Rudbeckia, but I'm starting to trade some of those out for other natives. But in the meantime, the stalks are just flopping all over everything and crushing anything new I plant. So if I remove the whole stalks with the seed heads intact, can I set them somewhere where birds can access them and still do the same good, or do they have to remain on the plant?
Yeah, I imagine it's the same as when you're kind of cutting back. First of all, there's no ecological reason to cut back your dead flower stems in the spring. It's more, keeping our neighbors happy kind of thing. What I do in very late winter, early spring, once it's kind of warmed up, is I'll give all of my dead perennial stalks a chop, but I'll try to do it at varying heights. There's no rule, by the way, about, it has to be 60 degrees overnight for X number of days. That's not, I think that is like a rule that's going around. That's not actually a rule. Different insects emerge at different times. So whenever you choose to do that in the spring, if it's in your front yard, if it's in your backyard, you don't have to do it at all. But I would leave kind of stalks of varying heights for different species of insects that might like different lengths of stalks to nest or overwinter in. And then when I kind of do that chop, I'll leave those, that's kind of like my yearly mulch, is I'll leave those cut up stalks in my garden. That way, I don't know if there are any insects still inside them, they can come out and, you know, at worst, they're providing mulch for the new plants to grow. So I would imagine that if you cut those stalks of all those Rudbeckia and are able to leave them as kind of a mulch, that would be great. You're probably also going to be planting a lot more Rudbeckia by doing that, though, if you're leaving all the seed heads around. But a big mass of Rudbeckia sounds really lovely to me, so I don't know why you would change it.
And Susan asked,
For
what are some
diversity's
native-
sake.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jan.
Yeah. No, I know, I'm joking.
Susan asked, what are some native ground covers you'd suggest?
Yeah, so if you're in a shady area, you're thinking about all of the fern species. It really depends on your soil moisture. But some other favorites are wild ginger and bloodroot and all of those, like I'm totally blanking on the ephemerals, like all of those ephemerals that you think of are so great for that. If you're in a sunny spot, I'm thinking first about grasses and sedges. Somebody mentioned Mount Cuba in the chat, and so I will mention a really awesome resource that Mount Cuba just published on carex, on sedges, where they compared lots of different native species of carex and how well they tolerated being mowed, which of them prefer sun or shade or all of these different things. So really a really great resource if you are considering like a lawn alternative and planting sedges. But sedges are also one of my favorite. There are shade-loving species, I was about to say, for like sunny spots, but there are shade-loving species of sedges as well. Pennsylvania sedge and Appalachian sedge are probably some of the most common that you'll find. I have some like Cytops grama species planted in between my perennials in my backyard, which is very sunny and hot, that I also think are just beautiful.
And Peggy asked, how do you feel about violets for ground cover?
So my understanding is that most of the violets that pop up in my yard are not native. But violets as a genus actually support lots and lots of insects. So if you can find a native species of violets, that's a great, and it's one of those, I tend to not be one of those people that's like, it's not native, you have to get rid of it, or it's native, it's fantastic, leave it. Violets are one of the last weeds that I will actually remove from my yard. So I know that, you know, the little bees will come to them and it's better than turf grass. I sort of keep it in the same category as clover. So if you can find a native, all the better. They, as a genus, support lots and lots of insects. Otherwise, they're not native, but not terrible.
So does anybody else out there have any questions they'd like to ask Erin?
Did Laura just put the link to the carex publication? I actually keep it open as a tab on my phone. It's probably a really nerdy thing to do, but I feel like I reference it a lot.
So Erin, I'll take president's prerogative here and ask you a question.
Sure.
So you planted your native bed and it's like 3 or 4 years later and things have filled in too nicely. What do you have to do about dividing natives, or do you have to?
This is the best case scenario. And this is why I say you don't have to plant your entire yard at once, and you can kind of work one section or kind of one strip at a time. Because by year 3 or 4, things have filled in so nicely and you can start dividing and transplanting a lot of those. And that's what I've done in my yard. So after a few years, you don't have to buy as many new plants. If that's where you're getting your plants, is buying them already grown from nurseries, you can start splitting and dividing them. I've split and divided and transplanted several different natives in my garden, goldenrods and asters and some grasses. So definitely, it's like the best part about doing this kind of planting is that it sort of like starts becoming self-sustaining after a few years. The other thing I will say about looking at your plantings after a few years, and I'm doing this right now in my yard, we've been here for about 5 or 6 years now. So the areas that I planted the first year are mostly really full, but there are some spots where I can still see the mulch that I put down when I first planted that section. And that tells me that I need to do some more underplanting of some ground cover species. The taller things are doing really well, but I can still see the mulch. And then comes the ground ivy and the other things that we don't want growing under there. So if you can still see your mulch from your initial planting after 3 or 4 years, that's a signal that it's time to plant some more ground cover plants under there.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. This was just a fabulous presentation, and I want to thank everybody for coming. This has been one of our best attended lectures ever. So
Awesome.
thank you so much, and thanks for all the resources you've put in the chat. We really, really appreciate it. And you're getting lots of cute kudos in the chat box.
Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, wait for this heat to end and then start planting your fall plants.
Great. Good night, everybody. And thanks so much. And thanks again, Erin. This was truly great.